The list of topics for tonight. What does it mean? Well, it means a lot of different things. Post-examination reflection is one thing it means, and we'll do a little of that. But it also means precise ramblings. This is a sort of a second introduction to the course, and the marvelous thing about this part of the course is that we finished the course the last day. So we can relax. Well, we didn't really finish it, we didn't actually begin it, but at least we mentioned all the topics. Reason and religious belief, well, we've touched on all these topics. I'm going to focus again on beginnings, and again I think of 1904, and I quoted very early on in the course Husserl, Edmund Husserl, the German philosopher, who was 45 in 1904, and he wrote to his friend Brentano, "I am a beginner, a miserable beginner." So that was after years of reflection, so don't get discouraged after 6 weeks. On the gloomy side, I was thinking that the musical background for tonight or today would be music by Gustav Mahler that he wrote in 1904. Songs of the deaths of children. That seems a rather gloomy topic. Mahler was, in fact, preoccupied with that because a lot of his brothers and sisters died young. What I'm thinking of is as I'll spell out a little bit, the massive dedication to death that characterizes the 20th century. And it's not easy to see that, just as it's not easy to see the beauty of Mahler's music. You need a lot of hard work to sense beauty, but also you need an awful lot of hard work to sense ugliness. And that's part of our project in this half of the course. We touched on that on and off in the last few weeks. The remark of one student, shouldn't we be doing this all the time? Puzzling, getting insight, yes, but does it occur? So that's a topic. Now, the deaths of children, I'm not thinking so much of the deaths of, say, in Hiroshima or in Germany in the 40s. I'm thinking of death in the sense of mental death. There are children who grow up and live a long, miserable life. Okay, let's be cheerful about it. But certainly, death in the other sense is there. I was going to quote from page 81 of Process about the 40 million native people in India, the forest people who are not Hindus, who will likely be eliminated in the next 20 years. This is part of the horror of the 20th century. The question of the forests, it comes up in some of the lectures I'm not giving, which is easy for me, the death of the forests on the globe. And a topic we will move to in the third week is what can one do about that as a community? Yes, okay, Sean Connery may do some good by swinging through the trees. And you've all rushed out to see Sean Connery swinging. No? I know you students don't have time for the cinema. Okay, so PR then covers a lot of things, and I'm going to take it gently, and I'm going to list my usual 6 points, and we may not get through even the first 2, but let's list the other points. The second point, or the second topic, we've brought it up, I think, in the last 2 classes, Plato's cave. And if you notice from the notes of the last class, I had this down, 4 squared plus 1 props. Then we'll move back to the topic faith and reason, and reasoning. And we have a whole list of topics, which I'm not going to put down again. You have it from the previous day. Faith and the Bible, mystery, development, so on. And you can add in evil, and that topic I've already mentioned, the evil of an entire movement in culture that would turn children into zombies, if not... no, I was going to say worse, but no, it's worse being a live zombie than a dead hero. Okay. 5, I want to introduce an exercise. Exercise 2.5.24. It's about going on holidays. And 6, I won't even put down. I wanted to introduce the topic of self-discovery and the Christian God. You'll notice in the handout I gave you that there are 6 lectures, and we have 5 remaining. And in the next lecture, in fact, there's also faith and art. So it's quite an astonishing program. We will just skim through some of these topics, but opening up areas to different people. The exams were remarkable in that some people opened up quite strange topics. One student found the work very relevant to studying a particular novel of Henry James, and so on. And really the problem is to invite you to discover yourself a certain amount, to at least name your 13 elements, and then you're on your own. You're not a believer. You don't believe me. You don't claim later, well, we learned from McShane about Lonergan's view of 13 elements. No, I discovered me is the issue. And it's quite amazing how some of you have pushed that through in the last 6 weeks. It took me about 6 years to get that far. You see how slow I am, okay? Okay, the question of PR. Some of you immediately, of course, think of PR, the PR degree, public relating. And that's a first meaning of this which amuses me, because this is above all not public relating. This is the sort of thing that got Socrates poisoned. To introduce the topic of self-discovery is to turn away from a certain public domain of non-self-attention, self-neglect. And I want to illustrate that by taking an institution. You recall we talked about institutions in the last couple of weeks. And one institution I took was the literature in philosophy of science. An institution that teaches people to have a certain view. What is scientific? And a lot of you are actually doing courses in scientific fields. What is scientific? What I want to bring out, and again it's a matter of reintroducing the topic and the exercises, is that there's an institution, and this one is Webster's dictionary, or any dictionary, which tells you something, and it may be totally wrong, but it's part of our ethos. Now let's take up that question, and I have here from Webster's dictionary a definition of scientific. Let's write it down. Okay, what is scientific? I want to get this accurate. Designating the method of research in which a hypothesis formulated after systematic, gosh, it does sound solemn, doesn't it? Systematic, objective, collection of data is tested empirically. All right. You like that? Sounds good? Yeah? Okay, now I want to take my time about this because I'm inviting you to do certain exercises on your own to continue this sort of work, to help you notice certain things. Some of you are already noticing, some of my teachers in the distance audience are noticing that, yeah, this has something to do with teaching. And yeah, memorization doesn't really get me very far. And what do I replace it with? Now, if you take this nominal definition of scientific, you will find, if you have textbooks in science, that in chapter 1 you'll get something like that. I won't quote the definite texts, but looking up texts I find phrases like, yes, you reach a hypothesis by careful observation and so on. I see a head nodding, yes. Now, the exercises that I'm inviting you to do, there are already some of them in the book, especially Process Chapter 3, Section 2. And in that section, I talk about reading books and noticing that the person doesn't know what they're talking about. And not to be hypercritical, because you probably don't know what you're talking about either. But at least you can do the exercises I mentioned at the very beginning. You look up the index of a book and you find that under Q, you only have questionnaire. And the book is, say, about children. Now, you may not be able to rewrite the book, but at least you've noticed something. Isn't that fair enough? Yeah? That there's something weird about this. Okay, now let's take this view of science that's not only in Webster's dictionary, it's in the books on philosophy of science, it's in textbooks that deal with science, like psychology, sociology, political science, economics, so on. It would take us a while to figure out what's wrong with this. So there's a sense in which I'm skipping along. It might be nice just to pause. Wouldn't it be funny if I strolled up and down here for about 10 minutes in front of the camera? Okay, scientific, designating the method of research in which there's a solemnity about this that you have to watch for. A hypothesis formulated after systematic, objective collection of data is tested. Okay, where does the hypothesis come from? It's formulated after a systematic, objective collection of data. Now, I'm going to suggest, and I don't want you to believe me, that that's not scientific at all. Okay? That's terrible. That's a formula for Zombieland, but it's also a formula for getting grants from Canada Council. A professor in Dalhousie joked to me once that he said, you don't apply to Canada Council unless you've got the work finished. You're supposed to be able to spell out your hypothesis. I can't imagine Galileo getting a grant. What do you want to do? Well, I'm trying to find out something. Well, what? Well, I don't know yet. Does that make sense? Yeah? Let's go back to our early puzzles. Okay, we'll remember Plato's cave as a topic. Okay. Now, this is are you with me? This is a systematic collection of data, okay? Is that fair enough? I'm collecting, and it's systematic. It's the regular way of writing down the alphabet, yeah? And it's objective, yeah? A, B, C, etc. Now, notice if I start there, well, we've only collected 3 pieces of data. Okay, do you all remember the leap that you do? Yeah. Okay, A, B, C, D, E. Oh no! Whoa, hold it. Okay. And I can write more of the alphabet. Okay, I'm collecting. It's a collection of data. Okay. And it's sort of objective. We can all agree on the alphabet. And it's sort of systematic, except the alphabet emerged randomly, but still. Yeah? How are we doing with this definition? Yeah? Doing okay? Okay, formulated after the systematic objective collection of data. Isn't there something odd here, yeah? Formulated, yeah? But where does it come from? Now, I'm inviting you to go back to our very first exercises, yeah? Where does the hypothesis come from? The notion that dominates a lot of scientific work is that there's a hypothesis around, and you're checking it out. It's the way you do a doctorate thesis. I have a hypothesis, let's test it. All trombone players are redhead and whatever. Real science, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, whatever. Real science is when you haven't got a hypothesis. Does that make sense? Yeah? Real science is when you have a puzzle. And what you haven't got is a hypothesis. Okay, where does this come from? Well, now let's go back to our second class, and I talked about the MCA view of mind as opposed to the MAC view of mind, the Big Mac view of mind. And if you remember, I attributed that to Scotus. That's remind you of Scotus, McAlpine, whatever, who thought and taught that your mind worked by collecting concepts and analyzing them or applying them. He's after Thomas Aquinas, died in 1306. Thomas Aquinas' view was this, and you'll find it talked about, say, on page 13 of Wealth of Self. How do you get a hypothesis? Remember our diagrams? You're puzzled about something, some sort of mess, and you work at it, and you're not in a hurry, and the teacher's not in a hurry, and you have time to mess around, and we'll do a little bit of it as we go along. You mess around, and wow! Straight up, round, down. Yeah? Some of you took days to get that sorted out. Some of you got another hypothesis. But the point I'm making is that the hypothesis comes from messing around, and you get an insight. And when you have the insight, you can spell it out. Okay? Spell out, let me write this down. Spell out a serious concept. Let's call it a hypothesis. Is that fair enough now? Recalling the puzzles we did and the puzzles you're still struggling with? Yeah? Some of you are getting great mileage out of section 2.5 in the book. But beyond the book, in your own lives, there's a mess. Friendship is breaking down. It puzzles you. Now, I want you to notice what normally happens. A sort of a mental bypass. It's not like a heart bypass. There's a mental bypass. The serious scientist works like this. And after weeks, they've got something in their minds. And then they write a book about it. Or maybe write a long paper about it. And they end up with a sort of a therefore. Like, for instance, Einstein, therefore, E is equal to mc squared. Have many of you seen this before, heard about it? Yeah? Sort of Time magazine level of science. Now, the mental bypass is that even in universities, teachers can bypass this and say, today we're doing the law of equivalence of energy and mass. And you're given this. And you never do this. And you haven't done any science. And the difficulty is that you can keep doing that and get a BSc and get an MSc and get a PhD, and you never notice that that has nothing to do with really doing science. Now, what I'm trying to get you to notice is the power of the little bit of analysis that we did, contained in these two diagrams, Wealth page 15 and Wealth page 48, or Process page 100. At the end of 6 weeks, you really haven't control of your understanding of the elements, okay? You couldn't possibly. It's like the piano. You have learned the scale from C to C, from C to shining C. But you can't even play flexibly around the scale. But yeah, you can name the elements. So after our 6 weeks, at least you can name the sequence of elements, okay? Some mess in sensibility makes you curious, and that curiosity can, if you're relaxed enough, can eventually generate an insight and a formula, a view, a theory, a hypothesis. And that enables you to talk intelligently. Now, does that make sense at this stage? Yeah? And the difference between the mental bypass and that is that you can't talk intelligently. Yeah? You can do a multiple guess exam. Yeah? But you can't say a damn thing about that if you've memorized it. How many of you have had that experience? Yeah? And you're getting 80s and 90s in your exams. What does that mean? Well, you can say, well, E is energy and M is mass and C is the velocity of light. Yeah, but why are they equal? Professor told me. Now, I want you to notice that. I mentioned Husserl being a beginner. I mentioned Socrates discovering he knew nothing. I don't want you to change your attitude towards exams, towards memorization. You've got to get that degree. But I want you to notice that perhaps you're not learning anything. And that's terrifically salvific. Yeah? You also notice that you're being duped. There's a an educator, I think his name is Paul Leonard, who wrote a book called Crap Detecting. So it's a terrific personal gain to discover that I am not understanding. I am not being human. And I am not being treated as human. And there are contemporary institutions doing that to me. And a large piece of that is contained in this little dictionary definition. A method of research in which a hypothesis, it's all very dull, do you notice that? Yeah? The hypothesis formulated, you collect data, and it fits. But there's no excitement, there's no creativity. And some of you have noticed the fun, the excitement of trying to do these funny puzzles. Now, the puzzles I gave in the first half of the course were puzzles like this. I'm adding to those now puzzles about things that you may read or hear. And I'm wondering, can you notice? Let's take the next illustration. Okay. Exercise 2.5.19 in the book. It's a phrase. I think the phrase is this: he doesn't understand the concept of money. Okay. It's from the film The Rain Man. Many of you have seen that film with Dustin Hoffman. It's a pretty powerful film. Okay, or you may not rise to that high level of art. So let me quote from a lower level of art. Jean-Luc on Star Trek recently remarked, you know the way they head out and they meet something strange. And I'm quoting, I wrote it down immediately because it was so right on as an illustration. Says he, I wonder, does it understand the same concept of reason that we do? Okay. Now what I'm doing is I'm inviting you to do exercises that aren't mathematical now. And some of you, I hear, breathing a sigh of relief. Some of you hate the sight of formulae. Eh? Yeah. Okay, I wonder, does it understand the same concept of reason that we do? Now, what this illustrates here and here is the way in which a false notion of mind, of thinking, gets into a language and warps our view of ourselves. Okay, now I'm wondering, again, I should pause for 10 minutes and stroll up and down. Reminds me of a story about two mathematicians. I enjoy they're working on a very heavy sequence of formulae, and one man is proving line by line, and like all great mathematicians, you find that one guy says, well, and it's easy to see from that. And the second mathematician looked at it and he said, I can't see that. So he walked off and wandered about and went to his own desk and worked and walked and worked. And he came back and he said, oh yeah, it's obvious. Okay. After a couple of hours. Okay. But there's a double point to this problem here. And you may think I'm nitpicking. Understand the same concept. Understand the concept of money. Now, on the view of reasoning that we have been dealing with, this just does not describe the way we work. What do we do when we puzzle? And again, we're back to the first four elements. Some of you, not the good people, but some of you thought, well, okay, now we've got that down, let's move on. This may help you to notice that, oh, wow, I didn't see that at all. What do we understand? Well, right back to that initial diagram, something, some mess, is related to us as puzzlers. Now, what do we understand? I could stop and get you to talk about that. What you try and understand is the mess. Isn't that fair enough? Yeah? Insight into experience. You puzzle about the experience and you have an understanding. Okay? And what you're understanding is the mess. You're not understanding a concept, you're producing it. Understanding produces a concept. Now, one of the problems you'll have to face in your reading is the usage of the word concept where the person actually means name. What do you mean by money? Well, money is a name for a certain mess of transactions. So he doesn't understand the concept of money. That is based on a false view of the human mind. He doesn't understand money. If he did understand money, he'd have a concept of money. Okay, this is going to be quite important when we get to point 6 of today's class, which is about self-discovery and the Christian divinity. Okay, I'm illustrating now a type of exercise that is related to close reading. That you notice that a person betrays their ignorance, their stupidity, their intellectual background by the way they phrase certain things. Now, this, as I say, is doubly significant. The same concept of reason that we do. Well, what concept of reason has the person who's writing the dialogue in Star Trek have? Now, that's a good question. I won't push it. How do you get a concept of reason? We're back at our first class. How do you get a concept of reason? I bet some of you are puzzled. Yeah? You get a concept of reason by puzzling over the mess that is me, reasoning. Okay? Is that fair enough at this stage? Remember I said 2 weeks ago, we're not studying reason according to Kant or Hegel or Bernard Lonergan. We're puzzling about the mess that we are, and we reason. Yeah? You found your way to, as I mentioned on the first night, the duet classroom. You found your way to turn on the television, find the channel. We reason. What is it that we do? Okay? And the understanding is of that experience. Okay, so again, it's puzzling about experience, which eventually, maybe, gets you to an insight, and then you have a concept of reason. And what is your concept of reason now? Let me be optimistic. Your concept of reason, me reasoning, is such now that when I write down this diagram, you can talk intelligently about it. Okay? Are we making sense? And I'm back to the word scientific. What I'm trying to stop you doing is a mental bypass. Yeah? Memorize the 13 elements and wow, you get 50 at least. Well, that didn't work out. You all got your exams back. Okay? So we're doing a scientific investigation of ourselves, and there's no easy way. You got to muck around with me reasoning. And me reasoning as I read. Reading phrases like that and that. Reading the dictionary. But the main point is, yes, the understanding is of some experience, and it produces a concept. Now, after 6 weeks, what sort of a serious hypothesis is this? Well, you can pretty well name the 13 elements in the right order. Yeah? Most of you. And it's not just memorized. Okay. The final 3 words in this is tested empirically. Now, what does this mean? In the books on philosophy of science, it really stresses observing carefully. Let me summarize what's behind Webster and the philosophy of science books. Okay. What do we think science is? Well, no, let me not be too optimistic. What do I think science is? I think science can be specified in terms of these first 7 elements. Okay? Something, we'll call it a mess, falling bodies, waves in water, electricity, magnets, whatever. Something makes you curious, and your wonder eventually generates a hypothesis which can be enormously remote from the original mess. Think of, say, a magnet, the way you can make iron filings get into a pattern with it. It's all very nice. Well, then you think of Maxwell's equations, all these funny signs that have a meaning. You can write down the equations. Okay, science is puzzling over some mess, eventually getting insight, which may be right on. You don't know. It looks good, you get all excited. Remember our puzzle the last day about around the end of a season? And I've had other answers from other people on other puzzles, and it's just marvelous to see the various possible hypotheses. You've got to about 40 hypotheses on that one puzzle, haven't you? You'll have 50 by the end of the course. Okay, that's the scientific procedure, and this is the key activity. And when you get this far, you ask, and notice in your exam papers, there's a tendency for people to say, I asked myself. You don't really ask yourself, do you? You ask, is that really so? Well, maybe some of you do. You know, you leave your notes and you sidle over to the mirror and you have a little chat with yourself. Okay, you ask, is Is that right on? And you muck around more, and you have this in mind. You think of experiments and so on. And at some stage, you are intelligent enough to come up with a, yeah. Okay. And you have a verified hypothesis about experience. Now, because of the influence of our friend Scotus, the theory of science that you will find in modern literature leaves out these four elements. Isn't that hilarious, if it wasn't so pathetic? And in leaving out those four elements, it influences the pursuit of science in universities, the teaching of science in schools. Now you can see perhaps what I mean by the death of children. Now, I say the scientist does this, but the child cannot be a scientist without doing this. You can be taught the answers. You bypass mind. And that can go on for years. I bet some of you did science and mathematics and that grade 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, first year university, second year university, third year university. Oh, God. Yeah? And where is it? You weren't actually doing science. Isn't that a sad state of affairs? Yeah? Why am I smiling? Oh, God, because you need a sense of humor to survive this. Okay, so back to that notion of science from Webster's dictionary, which is an institution in dictionaries, books on philosophy of science, in the way science is taught, and it is false. And how are you to come to an agreement with me? By discovering it yourselves. Remember my insistence that you're not believers. You're not supposed to believe me. Okay? Yeah? Do you believe me? No, you're to find this yourself. And it can be remarkably difficult. I had a chap in my office yesterday, and he was insisting that, no, Ising has nothing to do with what's real. I can put my hand on that. And I say, can you? And he'd nod. And I couldn't get him to notice that he wasn't just, you know, somebody with Alzheimer's or shaky head. He was nodding intelligently. But it is quite difficult, if you've been trained badly, to stop and say, golly, this is me. I'm a scientist. Maybe. Or maybe you're a victim. You've got to find that out. And be happy about it. Gosh, I have a BA now and I've learned nothing. Okay. So tested empirically, again, this is phrased in a way that doesn't draw attention to the intelligence. Yeah? Somebody bright enough to be able to observe properly and to understand the hypothesis and its consequences comes up with a, aha. Yeah. Any query about that? It's the question of science. It's the question of reasoning. What is reasoning? It's where we started at the beginning, but this is a review, a procedural review. Okay, I could go on endlessly about this. I have a series of illustrations which I tied in with the end of 1 Corinthians 13 in a glass darkly, relating to how you can find out how science works. You can be a scientist at home in the kitchen. One of the illustrations you'll find is on page 24 of Wealth of Self. It's connected with Boyle's law. Now, if you're being taught badly in chemistry or physics, a teacher will come into class and say, today we are going to do Boyle's law, and write it down, yeah? Now you've got it, now let's check it out. What's happening? Bypassing mind. How do you teach a class Boyle's law? Okay, it's the question of the glass. You're washing dishes in a sink, okay? And in your family, nobody washed the dishes until they were over 18. Yeah? And there you are on your 18th birthday doing your first dishwashing, and you're pulling a glass out of the sink, and you notice that the water's up to there in the glass. How many of you have noticed that? Yeah? Or do you all have dishwashers? Yeah? That you can pull the glass up and the water stays in the glass. Isn't that odd? Yeah? And you ask why? Maybe. Now, the maybe is that maybe I've been using right through the course. Maybe. Maybe you don't. Sometimes in class I put a piece of chalk on the desk. This is perhaps too big to be pushing around here. And I bump into the desk, and what happens to the chalk on the desk? Many of you know? I bump into the desk like that. The chalk comes towards me. How many of you have noticed that? Huh? No? Or better, my other glass experiment. You're at a cocktail party and somebody offers you a triple vodka and tonic. And there you are dying of thirst, and you look down and there's a fly. Any of you have that experience yet? And you don't want to say, well, what's this fly doing in my drink? And the hostess will say immediately, oh, it's doing the breaststroke. So you look down, and so as not to cause embarrassment, you move the drink around, yeah? You want to get the fly to the other side so you can have an ounce of vodka, yeah? And what happens? Many of you have done this. Yeah? The fly stays here. Yeah? Why? And again, you have to notice whether you're still alive. Yeah? Why does the fly stay here? You can do it with a bit of paper or anything in it. And the other glass scientific piece of work is, I think, in exercise, I think it's 2.5.18. If you have a glass floating in the sink, well, it doesn't really float very steadily like that, does it? Unless you put in, say, a couple of stones, all right? And it steadies up. Now, suppose you have another stone. You have the glass floating like this, okay? I'm thinking of some of my very keen students. They'll be up all night doing this. Suppose you put in another stone, okay, into the glass. And then you measure the height of the water here. Now you take the stone out of the glass and you put it into the sink. Which will make the water rise more? Isn't that an interesting puzzle? Yeah? Maybe. And again, I'm emphasizing the maybe, to bring out the fact that we may have been educated not to be interested. Yeah? And that's not so bad when it's just about a glass in the sink. But when it's about the economic level of a country, then it's vital that there's a serious interest. And what dominates our discussions of the economy is this other scientific view. There's got to be a hypothesis around. Does that make sense? That there's a way in which our culture doesn't do this when there's a mess. And it becomes part of the entire academic tradition. That's a pretty dark picture, eh? Okay, so I'm introducing you to some of the other puzzles. And the key here is not, or the problem here is not to solve the puzzle, but to discover something about yourself. Some people are disappointed that they didn't solve all these puzzles in section 2.5. Well, now, the exercise I mentioned down here, 2.5.24, that I want to introduce before the end of the second session, that is an exercise that Bernard Lonergan spent from 1953 to 1963 doing. 10 years. So don't be disappointed. The real achievement is to find out, golly, this is me, and this is how I be human. I be's human by understanding. Okay. Now introducing the end exercises. I'm going to get to this exercise on the holidays. But you'll find that I get back to the exercise about the friendly universe. 2.5, okay, point 22.23. You'll find the topic coming up of friendly, benevolent. What is it to be benevolent? What is it to be friendly? And this exercise, these exercises plunge you right back into the central definition, description I gave you of philosophy. You remember it vaguely, perhaps? I came up with the notion that philosophy is a creative interest in creative interest. Okay, and you may remember the diagram there. I had two people face to face, Jack and Jill, Poldy and Molly. What is it to be interested in the other? Well, the other, if the other is alive, is a creative interest. And to be interested surely means to be creatively interested. So you need a creative interest in the other person. And the point I emphasized was that you can't observe creative interest. How are you to understand creative interest? By having a creative interest in yourself. Okay, now this, we're going back over what we covered in 5 weeks and perhaps discovering that, gosh, there's more to this than I imagined. This is very difficult to get at. We're back to the prologue, detecting. And we're leading forward to what we're going to get into shortly, the question of faith. And we're leading into the topic of Plato's cave. What is it to have a creative interest in creative interest and to come up with an understanding of it? And what is this transition to understanding? And is it perhaps the case that this transition is not really current in our culture? This is a shocking thing to think of. And when we get into Plato's cave, that will be the issue. That perhaps the bypassing of mind is a characteristic of the century in which we live. That there's a tremendous flow of collected data. And it's systematized, and it's computerized, and it's organized. And there may not be that much insight. Isn't that a very strange notion? A vast flow of information. I mentioned last day that this isn't us come of age. We're not down out of the trees yet. Okay.